Short description. During the Korean War, a company of American soldiers is ordered to hold Hill 214 against an overwhelming enemy assault. As the battle rages, young Lieutenant Jack Reynolds must navigate the horrors of war, rally his men, and make impossible decisions to survive. With reinforcements delayed and morale dwindling, the soldiers face the ultimate test of courage and sacrifice. The cold wind howled over the frozen landscape, cutting through the thick wool uniforms of the American soldiers huddled in their trenches. Snow mixed with mud beneath their boots, and the scent of gunpowder lingered in the air. Lieutenant Jack Reynolds adjusted his helmet, his fingers numb from the biting cold, as he scanned the darkened horizon. Hill 214 was just another numbered position on a map, but for Reynolds and his men, it was everything. If they lost this hill, the enemy would gain a direct route to the supply lines below, jeopardizing thousands of American and Allied troops. Reinforcements were promised, but in war, promises were often empty. Private Charlie Miller, a wiry kid from Ohio, clutched his rifle and exhaled sharply. "Sir, do you really think they'll come tonight?" Reynolds sighed. "Intel says they will, and I trust Intel as much as I trust a fox not to eat a rabbit." A low murmur of nervous laughter passed through the trench. The men knew what was coming. The Chinese forces had been pushing hard, and Hill 214 was their next target. A quiet tension settled over the troops, broken only by the occasional cough or the distant rumble of artillery. Sergeant Tom Grady, a battle-hardened veteran, crouched beside Reynolds. "Lieutenant, we're down to half rations and morale's hanging by a thread. We need good news." Reynolds clenched his jaw. "Tell them to hold. Reinforcements will be here in the morning. We just need to make it through the night." Grady nodded and moved down the line, whispering words of encouragement. Meanwhile, Reynolds peered through his binoculars. Shadows moved in the distance. The attack was imminent. The first assault. The night exploded in fire and chaos. Mortars whistled through the air, slamming into the hillside and sending dirt and debris flying. Then came the battle cries, the unmistakable sound of an enemy charge. "Positions! Hold the line!" Reynolds shouted, gripping his rifle. The enemy swarmed up the hill, their silhouettes barely visible against the snow. Machine guns opened fire, cutting down dozens, but more followed undeterred. The trench erupted in gunfire, each soldier fighting desperately to repel the attackers. Miller fired until his rifle clicked empty, then fumbled for another magazine. "They're everywhere." Grady swung his rifle like a club, knocking an enemy soldier back before shooting another. "We hold this damn hill, or we die trying." Reynolds took down 3 enemies in quick succession, his heart pounding. Blood and snow mixed underfoot, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the night. Despite their bravery, the enemy continued to push forward. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the assault ended. The enemy fell back, leaving bodies strewn across the hillside. The Americans had held for now. Breathing heavily, Reynolds surveyed his men. They were battered but standing. "Good work, boys. But they'll be back." Grady wiped sweat and grime from his face. "Damn right they will." The cost of war. Dawn brought no relief. The cold was merciless, and exhaustion weighed on every soldier. The wounded groaned in agony, their bandages soaked through. Supplies were running low, and the radio remained silent. No word from command, no sign of reinforcements. Reynolds knelt beside Private James Harper, a young recruit with a bullet wound in his leg. "Hang in there, Harper. We'll get you out of here." Harper managed a weak smile. "I just want to go home, sir." Reynolds squeezed his shoulder. "You will. I promise." But he wasn't sure he believed it himself. As the sun climbed higher, the enemy prepared for another assault. The Americans braced themselves, steeling their nerves. They had no choice but to fight. The last stand. The second attack came with even greater ferocity. Artillery pounded the trenches, forcing the soldiers to duck for cover. Then came the wave, hundreds of enemy troops storming up the hill. "Hold the line. Fire at will." Reynolds bellowed. Gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through enemy ranks. The ground shook with explosions, and the stench of smoke and blood filled the air. Men fell on both sides, their screams lost in the cacophony of war. Miller was hit, a bullet ripping through his side.
Sarge.
He collapsed, blood soaking the snow. Grady dragged him back, pressing a bandage to the wound. Stay with me, kid. Reynolds fought like a man possessed, his rifle an extension of himself. But the enemy kept coming. They were running out of ammo, running out of time. Then, just as hope began to fade, a new sound cut through the battlefield, the distant rumble of aircraft engines. Reinforcements, someone shouted. American bombers roared overhead, unleashing hell on the enemy. Artillery shells rained down, breaking the assault. Then, from the valley below, fresh troops advanced, pushing the enemy back. Reynolds collapsed against the trench wall, exhaustion overtaking him. They had survived. Aftermath. The hill was littered with bodies, a grim testament to the battle. Medics worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded. Harper was carried away on a stretcher, his face pale but alive. Miller, too, was stabilized, though his fighting days were over. Reynolds stood with Grady, looking out over the battlefield. We held. But at what cost? Grady sighed. War always takes more than it gives. As the sun set over Hill 214, Reynolds knew that this victory, like all victories in war, was bittersweet. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And tomorrow, they would fight again. For the men who had fallen. For the ones who would never go home. For the promise of peace that always seemed just out of reach. As he walked away, his boots crunching in the snow, Reynolds whispered a silent vow to remember every name, every sacrifice. Because in the end, that was all a soldier could do. The war would rage on, but so would they.